I was sitting in the living room of the house I bought 15 years earlier. The mortgage paid off the television on low when my son-in-law walked in and turned it off like I was a guest who had overstayed his welcome. He told me it was time for me to leave. My daughter stood there and said nothing. She did not defend me. She did not look at me. I did not argue. I picked up my keys and walked out of my own front door without raising my voice. I did not know where I would sleep that night, but I knew one thing. If I spoke, I would lose control. So I stayed silent. For 24 hours. I did not call my daughter. I did not explain myself. I let the silence do the work. The next morning, a man, in a tailored suit, knocked on the door of that house. He was not there to shout. He was not there to threaten. He was there to deliver papers that would change everything. My name is Rick, and this is not a story about revenge. It is a story about boundaries, ownership, and what happens when a man finally stops stepping aside. Stay with me. The television was on low, just enough sound to remind me it was there. A traffic report rolled by, something about Highway 75 backing up near Spring Creek Parkway. I had heard it 100 times before. I sat in my usual chair by the window holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold without me noticing. It was early January 2025. Outside Plano looked the way it always did after the holidays. Bare trees, quiet streets, everything in its place. Inside the house, nothing seemed out of order either. Same couch, same photos on the wall, same living room where I had stood in 2018 and told myself I was finally done paying for this place. I bought the house in 2010. Lauren was still in college then. I remember signing the papers thinking this would be the one thing nobody could ever take from me. A roof, a foundation, something solid. That night it didn't feel solid at all. Brandon was pacing near the kitchen island, phone pressed against his palm, shoulders tight. He had been like that since dinner. Short answers. Cabinets closing a little too hard. The sound of frustration filling the space even when he didn't speak. I had seen this version of him before. It usually showed up when money was involved. Lauren stood near the hallway, arms folded, watching him, without really seeing him. She hadn't looked at me once all evening. Brandon stopped pacing and turned toward me. He reached for the remote on the side table and shut the television off. The room went quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Like he wanted to make sure I heard what came next. He told me to get out. There was no shouting, no explanation. Just those two words dropped into the room like they had been waiting there all along. I stayed where I was. Lauren didn't move either. She didn't tell him to stop. She didn't say my name. She didn't say this is my father or this is his house. She looked past me toward the front door. I waited. Not because I needed permission, because part of me still expected something different. An apology. A pause. A moment where someone remembered how we got here. Nothing happened. I looked at Lauren. Our eyes met for a second. Then she looked away. That was when I understood this wasn't anger speaking. This was a decision that had already been made. I was just the last one to hear it out loud. My chest tightened for a brief moment. Not enough to knock the air out of me. Just enough to remind me that this hurt. Then it passed. I stood up slowly. I carried my coffee mug to the sink and set it down. I straightened the chair I had been sitting in the same way I always did. It was a small thing, but it mattered to me. Order still mattered. Brandon crossed his arms and watched me waiting for a reaction that never came. I walked down the hallway toward the room that used to be the guest room. Back in 2019, when Lauren and Brandon moved in, we had talked about it being temporary. A few months, maybe a year. Life had a way of stretching those timelines until nobody remembered the original plan. I pulled a small suitcase from the closet. I packed a change of clothes, my toothbrush, the old watch my father gave me before he passed. I paused for a second, looking at the framed photos on the dresser. Lauren as a kid missing a front tooth. Her graduation day. I left them where they were. When I came back into the living room, Brandon was already on the couch, scrolling through his phone like the conversation was finished. Lauren stood by the front door now, keys in her hand. She looked uncertain. Or maybe she looked relieved. I wasn't sure anymore. I picked up my jacket. Lauren asked where I was going. Her voice sounded small, like she didn't expect an answer. I told her I would figure it out. That was all. The door closed behind me with a quiet click. No slam, no drama. Just a clean sound that felt final. Cold air hit my face on the porch. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door. A part of me waited for it to open again. It didn't. I walked to my car and sat inside without starting the engine. The lights were on in the house. My house. The one I paid for. The one I worked decades to keep. I reached into my pocket and wrapped my fingers around my keys. They felt heavier than usual, solid, real, proof that not everything had been taken from me, at least not yet. I didn't call anyone. Not a friend. Not my sister. Not even Lauren. I knew if I spoke, I might say something I couldn't take back. And I knew that once words were out there, they had a way of giving other people control over them. Silence felt different. Silence felt like something I could still own. I started the car and pulled away from the curb. The street looked the same as it always had. Neat, predictable, unbothered by what had just happened inside one house. As I drove, a memory came to me without warning. Lauren, maybe 6 years old, asleep in the back seat after a long drive, her head leaning against the window. I had promised myself back then that I would always be there for her. I wondered when being there had started to mean stepping aside. I wasn't angry. I wasn't broken. But something in me had finally stopped moving out of the way. I checked into a small roadside motel a few miles away. The room smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old carpet. I sat on the edge of the bed, keys in my hand, and stared at the blank wall across from me. I knew staying quiet might make things worse before they got better. I knew it might cost me relationships I wasn't ready to lose. Still, it felt like the only honest choice I had left. 24 hours, I told myself. I could be silent for that long. And for the first time since I walked out that door, I lay down and slept. Sleep came easier than I expected, but it did not stay long. Sometime before dawn, a truck rolled past the motel, and the vibration pulled me back to the surface. For a few seconds, I lay there staring at the ceiling, unsure where I was. Then the memory settled in the porch light. The closed door, the street that did not care. I sat up slowly and let my feet rest on the carpet. The room was quiet in a way that felt temporary, like it belonged to someone else. A thin strip of morning light slipped through the curtains, cutting across the wall. I rubbed my face and breathed out. My body felt stiff, older than it had the night before. The motel was nothing special. A bed, a small table, a chair that rocked slightly when I shifted my weight. I filled the coffee maker with tap water and watched it sputter to life. The smell was faint, almost apologetic. I drank it anyway, standing by the window watching cars come and go from the parking lot. No one looked at me. No one needed to. Lauren and Brandon moved in with me back in 2019. At the time, it felt like the right thing to do. They had just gotten married. Housing prices were climbing. I told them to take the guest room and stay as long as they needed. No rent. No paperwork. I said family does not need contracts. I meant it. In the beginning, everything felt shared. Meals together. Conversations that lasted past midnight. Brandon thanked me often. Lauren smiled the way she used to when she was younger, like she felt safe. Somewhere along the way, that changed. It did not happen all at once. It never does. Brandon started making decisions without asking. New furniture arrived while I was at work. The thermostat stayed where he set it. The garage filled with his tools, my shelves pushed aside. When I mentioned it, he told me it was more efficient this way. Lauren stopped checking in with me. She would tell me what they had decided, not ask what I thought. A new cable plan. A different internet provider. House rules that seemed to form around me, not with me. I told myself I was being generous. I told myself this was what support looked like. Standing there in that motel room, coffee growing cold in my hand, I felt something heavier settle in. I had mistaken love for permission. I had confused patience with absence. One memory kept coming back to me. A quiet one. Months earlier, I had come home with groceries and found my chair gone from the living room. Brandon said it blocked the walkway. He suggested I use another one. I had laughed it off. Picked a different chair. Told myself it was no big deal. That morning I understood what it had been. A test. And I had failed it without even knowing there was one. By late morning I stepped outside and walked the length of the parking lot. A family loaded suitcases into an SUV. A man in a work uniform leaned against a wall, scrolling on his phone. Life moved around me, uninterested and intact. I checked my phone. One missed call from Lauren. No message. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, then put it back in my pocket. If I called her, I knew how the conversation would go. She would say she was tired. She would say Brandon was under a lot of pressure. I would say I understood. And something in me would shrink again. Back in the room, I opened my laptop. Not because I was angry. Because I needed to know where I stood. I pulled up the county property records and typed in my address. The page loaded slowly. When it appeared, it was clear. Owner name. Mine. No additions. No changes. Just the facts unchanged by feelings. I logged into my bank account next. Same result. Accounts in my name. Bills drawn from my checking. The structure was still there, even if the foundation inside the house had cracked. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. The relief surprised me. It was followed almost immediately by something sharper. Regret. I had not lost control. I had handed it over piece by piece, thinking it would keep the peace. And now the peace was gone anyway. The fear came next, quieter but more dangerous. The thought that if I did nothing, this version of my life would solidify. That one day I would wake up and realize I had become a guest in my own daughter's world, tolerated but unnecessary. I also thought about the risks. About what could happen if I stepped forward now. Legal trouble. Family fallout. The possibility that Lauren would not forgive me. The possibility that my grandson would grow up hearing a different version of who I was. None of that made the choice easier. By afternoon, the room had warmed enough that I turned on the air conditioner. The steady hum filled the space. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, weighing options that no longer felt optional. I considered driving back, apologizing for the tension. Pretending the words from the night before had not landed where they did. The image made my stomach tighten. I thought about Lauren standing by the door, keys in her hand, not stopping him, not stopping me. That was when I understood what silence really meant. It was not retreat. It was refusal. A decision to stop erasing myself to make room for someone else. As the day slipped toward evening, I opened my contacts and scrolled. There was a name I had not touched in years. Thomas Reynolds, real estate attorney. We had crossed paths once over a minor property dispute long ago. He had been calm, precise, honest about limits. I hovered over the number, then put the phone down. Not yet. I set an alarm for early the next morning, early enough that doubt would still be asleep. When the sky outside faded to dark traffic noise picked up on the highway, I lay there listening to it, aware of the weight of the choice ahead of me. I knew that one phone call could change everything, not just paperwork, relationships, how my daughter saw me, how I saw myself. I turned onto my side and closed my eyes. Tomorrow I would make the call, and whatever came after, I would face it standing up. Morning found me already awake. The alarm sounded anyway, sharp and unnecessary. I shut it off and sat on the edge of the bed, feet on the carpet, letting the moment settle. The motel room felt smaller in daylight, temporary, like it was reminding me I was not meant to stay. I dressed without thinking and stepped outside. The air was cool, clean, the kind that clears your head whether you want it to or not. I drove toward the office as traffic thickened, the same roads I had taken for years, now feeling different, because I was seeing them with a decision already half made. I parked and stayed in the car for a few seconds with the engine off. My hands rested on the steering wheel. I could still turn around. I could drive back to the motel, make another weak cup of coffee, wait for Lauren to call again. Nothing had been signed. Nothing had been sent. I opened the door and went inside. The office was quiet and orderly. Neutral colors, clean lines. A receptionist looked up and nodded, asked me to take a seat. I did. The chair was firm, steady. It did not shift when I leaned back. I noticed that. Tom Reynolds stepped out a few minutes later. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe more settled. He shook my hand and led me into his office. There were no personal touches, no family photos. Just files stacked neatly, pens, aligned a window looking out at a parking lot. He asked me to explain what brought me in. I told him the facts. The house, the years, the night I was told to leave. I kept my voice even. He listened without interrupting, without nodding in sympathy, without offering reassurance. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and folded his hands. He did not ask how I felt. He told me what mattered: ownership, documentation, process. He explained that the house was legally mine, clearly and entirely. That part was simple. He explained that allowing family to stay without a lease did not transfer ownership, but it did require care when asking them to leave. The law cared about steps, about notice, about timelines. 30 days, proper delivery, everything in writing. He spoke about self-help eviction and how quickly good intentions turned into legal problems when people acted out of pride or anger. He said courts did not care who was right in a family argument. They cared who followed the process. This is not about winning, he said, his voice steady. This is about doing it clean. I asked questions. Not to challenge him, but to understand the weight of what he was laying out. What if they refused to leave? What if they tried to claim rights they did not have? What if this turned into something long and expensive? What if my daughter stopped speaking to me? What if my grandson grew up hearing a version of this story where I was the villain? Tom did not soften his answers. He said legal action clarified relationships, it did not protect them. He said emotions would rise once papers were served. He said there was no way to control how people reacted, only how you acted. He also said that doing nothing was still a decision, one that handed control to someone else. I looked down at the edge of his desk. I thought about the motel room, the missing chair, the way Lauren had looked past me the night before. I felt a brief wave of doubt pass through me, sharp and unwelcome. The thought that maybe I was misreading everything, that maybe this would push things too far. It lasted only a moment. I asked him one last question. If I followed the process exactly, would I be protected? He said yes. As much as anyone ever was. He slid a document across the desk. An authorization. Simple. Direct. My name. His name. The scope of his work. No drama. No threats. Just a line waiting for my signature. My hand hovered over the pen. This was the point where intention became action. I thought about calling Lauren before I signed, about explaining myself one more time. I also thought about how many explanations I had already given over the years and how little they had changed. I signed. Tom took the paper, reviewed it once, then nodded. He told me the next steps would move carefully, but without delay. Notices would be prepared. Delivery would be scheduled. All communication would go through his office. Then he said something that settled heavily in the room. 24 hours from now, someone will be at the house. I did not ask who. I understood what he meant. I left the office with a copy of the paperwork folded in my jacket pocket. The sun was higher now. People passed me on the sidewalk, talking into phones, carrying coffee, moving through their day, without knowing what I had just put into motion. In the car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine. My hands were steady. That surprised me. The drive back to the motel felt shorter. I checked my phone once. No new messages. I set it face down and kept driving. The room looked unchanged when I returned. Same bed, same chair, same faint smell of cleaner. I sat on the edge of the bed and took the document out again. I read it slowly. My name was printed clearly at the top. Real. Fixed. That night, sleep came in fragments. Not from fear, but from thought. I remembered Lauren as a child asking me to check under her bed for monsters. I remembered Brandon shaking my hand the first time we met, careful and polite. I thought about how easily years slip by when no one stops to mark them. I also thought about cost, about time, about the money this could take, about the relationships that might not survive it. I understood that the person hurt most by what came next might not be the one who had told me to leave. Sometime after midnight, I stood by the window and looked out at the parking lot lights. Tomorrow someone would knock on my door. Not to ask, to deliver. I lay back down and stared at the ceiling until the dark began to thin. I had made the choice. All that was left was to stand by it. Morning arrived quietly, the sky a dull gray outside the motel window. I was awake before my alarm, lying still, listening to the steady rise of traffic from the highway. Somewhere across town, a door was about to open, and I would not be there to see it. That was intentional. I showered, dressed, and sat at the small table with my phone turned face down. I told myself I would leave it that way until noon. I did not need a play-by-play. Whatever was going to happen needed to happen without my presence turning it into a scene. The first vibration came before 9. I recognized the number even without looking. Brandon. I let it ring. When it stopped, the silence felt heavier than before. A minute passed. Then another vibration. I stood up and walked to the window, watching a sedan pull out of the parking lot. The phone went quiet again. I imagined the knock. Not loud. Not aggressive. A man standing straight, holding an envelope, speaking calmly. Brandon trying to take control of the conversation. Lauren standing just behind him, reading over his shoulder, absorbing words that could not be argued away. Another call came in. Then a text. Short, sharp. I did not read it. I turned the phone off. Late morning found me walking the edge of the motel lot. The air smelled like warm asphalt and oil. A delivery truck idled nearby, its engine humming. Somewhere a radio played low. Ordinary sounds, ordinary motion. The world did not slow down for personal earthquakes. Back in the room, I turned the phone on again. 6 missed calls. 4 from Brandon. 2 from Lauren. No voicemail from her yet. I called Tom instead. He answered himself. His voice was steady, professional. He told me the notice had been delivered properly and without incident. He said there was tension as expected, but no confrontation. He reminded me again not to engage directly. All communication should go through his office. I thanked him and ended the call. The next steps unfolded over the following days, not all at once, not dramatically. Just a series of small, deliberate actions, each one recorded somewhere, each one leaving a paper trail. I called the bank first. The representative confirmed my identity and asked how she could help. I asked to remove an authorized user from my credit card. She processed the request and gave me a confirmation number. When she asked if there was anything else, I said no. An email arrived minutes later. Subject line: confirmation of account change. I saved it. I contacted the cable company and the internet provider next. The accounts were in my name. I requested cancellation. Dates were set. Numbers were read back to me. I wrote them down. I made sure electricity and water remained untouched. Tom had been clear. Do nothing that could be interpreted as forcing someone out. Each call ended politely. Each one closed another door. I felt no satisfaction, only distance, like stepping back from a painting and finally seeing the whole thing. On the 3rd day, my phone rang while I was reading through documents Tom had sent over. The number was unfamiliar. I answered. A man asked for Brandon Hayes. I told him he had the wrong number. He apologized and hung up. I stared at the phone after the call ended. I did not need an explanation to understand what that meant. Systems were shifting. Accounts were being checked. Assumptions were failing. Later that afternoon, I drove past a home improvement store on my way to get groceries. The parking lot was full. Contractors loading lumber. Shoppers pushing carts. I barely noticed it at the time. That evening, the story reached me. Brandon tried to pay for a cart full of materials. Lumber. Hardware. Items he likely assumed were covered the way they always had been. The card was declined. He tried again. Same result. A clerk asked if he had another form of payment. People waited behind him. Someone sighed. The clerk remained calm. Brandon left without the supplies. I did not witness it. I did not need to. The moment found me anyway, carried in the strain of a voicemail that arrived later that night. It was Lauren. Her voice sounded different. Not angry. Not defensive. Unsteady. She said my name once, then again, quieter. She asked me to call her back. She did not mention the notice or the card or Brandon. She just said she needed to talk. I listened twice, then set the phone down. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to name what I was feeling. It was not relief. It was not triumph. It was the weight of consequences moving forward without asking anyone's permission. I also felt something else, smaller and harder to admit. A flicker of doubt. A question about whether I was becoming too cold. Whether distance once created had a way of hardening into something permanent. The next morning, another voicemail came in. Shorter. More urgent. She called me Dad. The word landed differently than it used to. Heavier. Riskier. I held the phone in my hand and listened to the air conditioner hum. I knew that even if the law moved cleanly and correctly, trust did not follow the same timelines. I knew that paper could restore order without restoring closeness. I did not call her back yet. There would be a moment when the noise settled, when words could be heard instead of thrown. Calling too soon would blur the lines I had finally drawn. For now, I stayed where I was. The notice had been delivered. The systems were shifting. Silence had already done its work. What came next would not be undone. The quiet broke in pieces, not all at once. A few days after the notice was delivered, I began to feel it in the air around me. Not in direct confrontations, but in glances that lasted a second too long, in pauses that felt intentional. Brandon had found his voice and he was using it everywhere he could. It started online. A neighbor I barely knew forwarded me a screenshot, asking if it was true. Brandon had written something vague, careful with names, but sharp with implication. Words about betrayal. About being forced out by someone who valued property over people. He did not mention me directly. He did not have to. Anyone who knew us could fill in the blanks. I did not reply. More posts followed, each one a little louder than the last. Each one painting the same picture: a father who had turned cold, a man who chose control over compassion. The comments underneath grew. Sympathy. Outrage. Advice offered by strangers who knew nothing beyond what they were being shown. I closed the app and set the phone down. The first legal pressure came soon after. Tom forwarded me an email from someone claiming to represent Brandon. The language was forceful, confident, full of warnings about consequences and reputational damage. It read like a threat written to sound official. Tom called me later that afternoon. He told me Brandon had hired an attorney. He paused, then said the letter lacked substance. No clear claims, no evidence, just noise. That word stuck with me. Noise. I stayed in the motel. I kept my days simple. Grocery store, gas station, back to the room. The more Brandon pushed, the more I reduced my world to what I could control. The rumors moved faster than I expected. At the grocery store, a woman from the neighborhood glanced at me twice before turning away. In the parking lot, a man slowed his car as he passed, then drove on without waving. No one confronted me directly. Judgment rarely does. It prefers distance. I told myself I could live with that. What unsettled me more was the idea of my story being told by someone else, shaped by anger, repeated until it sounded like truth. One morning as I was walking back to my car, I heard my name. Michael Grant stood near the sidewalk, hands in his jacket pockets. He had lived down the street from me for years. Retired military. Quiet. Observant. The kind of man who paid attention without announcing it. He asked if we could talk. We walked a short distance together away from the houses. He did not ask what happened. He did not ask who was right. He asked one question. Are you sure you are doing this by the book? I stopped and looked at him. I did not feel defensive. I felt tired. I told him yes. I told him I had a lawyer. I told him everything was in writing, timed, documented. I told him I was following the law exactly, no more and no less. He nodded once. People get loud when they feel cornered, he said. Quiet usually means someone knows where they stand. He placed a hand briefly on my shoulder and walked away. That conversation stayed with me longer than I expected. Years earlier, I had stood up for a coworker who was being blamed for a mistake that was not his. I remembered how uncomfortable that had been, how easy it would have been to stay quiet then. I had spoken up anyway, knowing some people would misunderstand. Standing alone now, I realized this was the other side of that choice. That afternoon, Tom called again. He had reviewed a second letter from Brandon's attorney. The tone had shifted. Less accusation, more hedging. Tom said that usually happened when someone realized they did not have the leverage they thought they did. Legally, he told me Brandon's position was weak. Hearing that did not bring relief. It brought clarity. The calls from Brandon increased. So did the messages, accusations, warnings, statements about what people were saying about me. I did not read them. I let Tom handle everything that needed handling. At night, lying on the motel bed, I thought about the man I had been for most of my life. The one who fixed problems quietly. The one who stepped aside to keep the peace. The one who believed being reasonable would always be enough. I wondered when that belief had started working against me. Another rumor reached me through a neighbor. Brandon had told someone I was cutting off utilities, trying to force them out without notice. None of it was true. All of it sounded believable if you wanted it to be. I imagined writing a message setting the record straight, explaining the facts, defending myself. I never did. Because facts move slowly, and panic moves fast. Late one evening, Tom called with an update. Brandon's attorney had softened his language again. The threats were fading. The confidence was thinning. When someone shouts this much, Tom said it is usually because they are running out of leverage. After the call ended, I sat in silence and thought about Lauren, about what she might be hearing, about how many versions of this story were reaching her ears, none of them spoken by me. That was the part that hurt the most. Not Brandon's anger, not the rumors, but the possibility that my daughter was being pulled further away by a narrative I was refusing to fight. Still, I stayed quiet, because I knew this much was true. The louder Brandon became, the clearer it was that control was slipping from his hands, and the more he tried to force his version of events, the less solid it sounded. I did not know how this would end. I did not know what it would cost. But I knew that shouting would not get me there. Silence backed by truth was already doing the work. Silence had carried me through the noise, but it could not carry the truth by itself. 2 weeks after everything began to unravel, Tom asked me to come back to his office. He said it was time to put the facts where everyone could see them. He did not explain more than that. He did not need to. I arrived early again. The same chair, the same desk, a wall clock ticking softly, steady enough to notice when the room was quiet. I sat with my hands folded, feeling the smooth surface of the armrests under my palms. Lauren came in a few minutes later. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. Her hair was pulled back without much thought. She glanced at me, then looked away, and took the chair across from mine. She did not speak. Brandon arrived last. He moved quickly like someone late to a meeting they did not want to attend. He chose the seat closest to the door and crossed his arms, eyes fixed on the table. Tom closed the door and sat down. He placed a stack of papers in front of him and adjusted his glasses. For a moment, the only sound was the clock. He began without preamble. He talked about years, not days, about patterns, not moments. 5 years in the house without rent. No lease, no savings set aside. Credit card balances that grew instead of shrinking. Statements that showed payments circling back on themselves, one card covering another, optimism doing the rest. He slid documents across the desk. Highlighted lines, dates, totals, the facts laid out plainly without tone or judgment. Lauren leaned forward as he spoke. At first, she looked confused, then focused, then very still. She picked up one page and turned it over, then another. Her fingers left faint creases in the paper. Brandon interrupted once. He said the numbers did not tell the whole story. He said everyone had debt, He said this was being blown out of proportion. Tom nodded and continued. The whole story, as it turned out, did not need embellishment. Expenses kept rising. Income did not. Purchases were made with confidence that tomorrow would cover today. Tomorrow never quite arrived. Lauren's breathing changed. Slower. Shallower. She stopped turning pages and stared at one line near the bottom of the stack. I watched her face shift, not in a dramatic way, but in stages. Hope fading. Recognition setting in. Acceptance arriving last and hardest. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not relief, not satisfaction. Grief. My mind went to Evan. He was 8 now. He loved dinosaurs and peanut butter sandwiches. He liked building things on the living room floor towers that collapsed easily, trusting that someone would help him rebuild. He believed adults knew what they were doing even when they did not. I wondered what part of this he would remember. The tension. The quiet arguments behind closed doors. The feeling that something was wrong without knowing why. I wondered whether standing my ground now would hurt him, or whether letting things continue would hurt him more later. Tom finished and leaned back in his chair. The clock kept ticking. Lauren finally spoke. She asked Brandon if what she was seeing was true. Her voice was steady but thin, like it was holding something back. Brandon shifted in his seat. He said they were managing. He said things were tight but temporary. He said Tom was making it sound worse than it was. Lauren did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She just looked at him, then back at the papers. She looked at me then. Really looked at me. For the first time since the night I left the house, I saw something familiar in her eyes. Not defiance. Not fear. Understanding. I spoke carefully. I told her I did not want to take her home away. I told her I wanted honesty, stability, something solid for her and for Evan. I told her I had tried to keep the peace by staying quiet, and that silence had only allowed things to drift further out of control. I told her this was not about punishment. It was about reality. Tom outlined the options. 30 days to move out. No court. No eviction record. Time to plan to find another place to reset. If they refused, the process would continue. Filings. Hearings. Public records that did not fade easily. I said nothing more. The room grew heavy with waiting. Minutes passed. The clock marked them one by one. I felt the weight of what this moment would mean long after the paperwork was done. How my daughter would remember this meeting. How she would explain it to her son. What would be lost even if something necessary was gained. I wanted to reach across the table, to tell her I was sorry, to tell her I loved her, to tell her wished things had been different. I stayed where I was, because clarity mattered more than comfort now. Lauren nodded. It was small, almost missed, but it was real. She said she understood. She said she needed time. She said she wanted to do this without turning it into something worse. Brandon looked at her startled, angry. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Tom wrote something down. The meeting ended quietly. No raised voices, no accusations. Just the scrape of chairs and the soft click of the door as Lauren left the room. I stayed seated after they were gone. The office felt emptier than before, like something essential had been taken out along with them. I knew the truth had done what it always does. It had clarified. It had corrected. It had also taken something with it. Some truths restore order. Others leave a space where trust used to be. As I stood and walked out, I understood that even when you do the right thing, you do not always get to keep everything you hoped to save. What came next would be cleaner, more stable. But something had been lost in that room, and I would have to live with that. I came home a few days after the meeting, the house quiet in a way it had not been for years. Not empty, just settled. The air felt different, like it had learned a new shape. Brandon was already gone. His things had been moved out quickly, efficiently, as if speed could soften the reality of it. The garage was half empty now. The shelves looked taller without his boxes stacked against them. I did not ask where he went. I did not need to know. Lauren was still there. She asked if she could stay for a short while, just until she figured things out. She did not ask as an owner or a partner in decision-making. She asked as a guest. The difference mattered to both of us. We sat at the kitchen table when we talked about it. No raised voices. No bargaining. I told her she could stay for a limited time. No spare key. No changes to the house. No assumptions about permanence. I told her I needed quiet and clarity. I told her this was not punishment, it was structure. She nodded. She said she understood. I believed her. The days that followed found a new rhythm. Lauren came and went, careful with her steps, as if she were learning the space again. We spoke politely, sometimes about Evan, sometimes about nothing at all. There was a distance between us, but it was no longer hostile. It was cautious. I noticed how much space one person can fill when they leave. The house breathed differently. Sounds traveled farther. Even the floors seemed to settle into themselves. One morning, Michael Grant called and asked if I wanted to get coffee. I hesitated, then agreed. We sat at a small place near the corner, the kind with mismatched chairs and a counter worn smooth by elbows. Michael stirred his coffee slowly and looked out the window for a moment before speaking. He said he had heard the noise. He said he had seen how people looked at me for a while. Then he said something simple. You did what a lot of men don't have the courage to do. I shrugged it off at first. I said I just followed the law. I said anyone would have done the same. Michael shook his head. Most people know what the law allows, he said. Fewer know what their limits are. Even fewer respect them. We drank our coffee in silence after that. I did not feel proud. I felt steadier. When I got back to the house, a locksmith's card sat on the counter where I had left it days earlier. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. Changing the locks was the last step. Not for safety. Brandon had not come back. He had not tried. This was not about fear. It was about finality. I stood at the front door for a long time before making the call. I ran my hand along the edge of the frame, the same spot where Lauren used to mark her height when she was little. Each line still there, faint but stubborn. I thought about what this door had seen. Arguments, birthdays, quiet nights, the moment I walked out with a small bag and nowhere certain to go. I called the locksmith. He arrived later that afternoon, efficient and polite. He worked quickly, asked no questions. When he handed me the new keys, they felt heavier than they should have. After he left, I stood in the living room and looked around. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I sat down on the couch and picked up the remote. I turned on the TV. The volume was too loud at first. I turned it down, then a little more. I stopped where it felt right. That small act settled something in me. I realized how many years I had adjusted myself to keep others comfortable. How often I had let decisions slide past me because they seemed minor. How those small concessions had added up to silence. Lauren passed through the room on her way to the kitchen. She glanced at the TV, then at me. She did not comment. She did not need to. That evening after she went to bed, I stayed in the living room alone. The house hummed softly. The clock ticked. The air conditioner clicked on and off. I thought about Evan again, about how change looks from the outside versus how it feels from the inside, about what it means to set boundaries, not to punish, but to preserve what remains. I knew this new order was fragile. It would be tested. Conversations still needed to happen. Decisions still lay ahead. But for the first time in a long while, the space around me felt honest. I sat there with the TV playing low, the volume exactly where I wanted it, and let the quiet settle into its new place. This was not victory. It was balance. And it was enough to breathe. Time did what it always does. It moved forward without asking permission. Weeks passed, then months. Not dramatically. Quietly. The kind of passing that only feels noticeable when you look back and realize your shoulders no longer sit as high as they used to. I stopped thinking of what happened as revenge. That word never fit. Revenge is loud. It wants witnesses. What I did was smaller than that. Harder. I restored order where it had been slowly eroded. I put boundaries back where I had once mistaken patience for love. Emily began to rebuild her life piece by piece. She found a small apartment not far from her work. Nothing fancy. Clean. Her own. She learned how much groceries really cost when you paid for all of them yourself. She learned how quiet a place can be when no one is arguing in the next room. Kyle faded out of our lives without a scene. No final confrontation. No apology. Just absence. At first that felt unsettling. Then it felt like relief. Some people do not exit with slammed doors. They leave behind a space where tension used to live. Noah still came by on Saturdays. He ran through the living room like he always had, shoes forgotten, backpack dropped where it landed. We built things on the floor again. Towers that collapsed. Cars that crashed into imaginary walls. He asked fewer questions than I expected. Children sense more than they ask about. When he left, the house did not feel empty. It felt complete. One morning I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and realized I had slept through the night. No waking up at 3 with my mind racing. No rehearsing conversations that would never happen. My body had finally accepted what my mind already knew. The danger had passed. I thought about the man I had been for years, the one who believed staying quiet kept the peace, the one who avoided conflict until it became the air everyone breathed. I had confused silence with strength. I learned the difference too late to avoid pain, but not too late to learn. Mark Harris stopped by one afternoon carrying a paper bag from the corner cafe. He set it on the counter and nodded toward the living room. "Looks different in here," he said. I smiled. It did. He did not ask questions. He never did. Before he left, he said something simple. "You stood your ground without losing yourself." That mattered more than he knew. At night, I sometimes sat on the couch with the lights low and the television barely audible. I chose what I watched. I chose when to turn it off. Small choices, the kind that had once slipped away without me noticing. I thought about the meeting in the lawyer's office, about the moment I signed my name and accepted that consequences would follow. I had been afraid then, not of losing the house, of losing my place in my family. What I learned was this: you do not lose your place by setting boundaries. You lose it by abandoning yourself. Real power does not belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the person who knows when to speak, when to stay quiet, and when to put their name on paper and let the process do its work. That was the last silence. Not the kind that erases you, but the kind that protects what remains. If you are listening to this and something in it feels familiar, if you have been shrinking yourself to keep everyone else comfortable, hear this. It is not too late. Not to set a boundary. Not to ask for clarity. Not to take your place back with calm and intention. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop arguing, stop explaining, and start choosing yourself quietly. If this story gave you something to think about, stay here. There are more stories like this. Stories about dignity, family, and the long road back to standing upright in your own life. I will be here, and I will keep telling them.